Well, it's been America Month here on Young Heretics, and my argument has been that if Pride gets a whole month, then certainly July 4th should extend even longer than a month. All year, really. It ought to be America year. But at the very least, we ought to spend some time talking about our country and what it means, the past and the present and the future of it. And in sort of preparation for this, as part of this, I've been talking about Julius Caesar and his decision to cross the Rubicon, whether it was fated, whether he had a choice. And today I want to talk about the anti-Caesar, the man himself, George Washington. Now, if you've been with me for this whole series, I've been hinting throughout that there is more to Caesar than mere necessity. That yes, history does have moments where things collapse, things fall apart. Yes, everything is fated to fall at some point or another. But nothing is written in the stars until it happens. And every individual has a choice within his sphere of influence. And those individuals that have a massive sphere of influence have a real choice, And this was, I've been arguing, as part of the ancient discourse about Caesar, that the die is cast is sort of this different line that gets used in different ways to say, well, he did have a choice. No, he didn't have a choice. And I've been hinting that our American history sort of indicates that there was another way. And so now I would like to defend that claim, because it's obviously, it's a big claim to say, well, yeah, like Rome was falling apart and maybe, the Republic was sort of eventually doomed, but Caesar didn't have to do what he did. What else could he have done? And, I can't exactly say what procedure might have worked better for Caesar. I've suggested that, somehow reimposing Republican rule would have been the truly virtuous and noble thing to do. And I also suggest that's very, very rare, but not impossible. It's not impossible to give power back. And that was the point of, reading Shakespeare's Caesar and reading some of the stuff from the Phoenici that Caesar was supposed to have quoted, right? He viewed himself as this, as this force, this figure, sort of led by history into absolute rule. And some of the detractors, like Cicero, were saying, no, you actually, you were led by ambition. You could have been led by the good of the Republic. You could have given us our liberties back, and you didn't. And I think that in our history, we have a real proof of that in the person of George Washington. Now, it has been suggested that Washington stands, that is, people who really love Washington, it has been suggested that we make too much of this, or that we've mythologized. Washington was never actually presented with a crown in the way that, say, Caesar was, during the Lupercalia, right? It was not as if somebody knocked on his door and said, "Hey, would you like to be king?" But I think I don't buy that. I do not buy the idea that there was no possibility for Washington to become king, or to become some sort of. I mean, people were clamoring for it, and people loved Washington as well. They ought to have, as well they might have. People loved Washington with a surpassing love. He had an army at his disposal. And he several times took the occasion to instruct them on their duties, not to himself as a person, but to the fledgling American state, which was coming into being, right? And I want to revisit today some of the ways in which he did that, some of the times when he did that, and holding him up against Caesar. I think we really can see, right, that it's not a joke, when you have that kind of power in a state that is vulnerable, right? Because the Roman state was vulnerable to, its class conflict and to the bribery that had been kind of corrupting the system. And it was vulnerable to takeover by a strong man, and Caesar, had that army at his back. And it's not a joke. This stuff, we think this stuff, oh, well, no, this couldn't really have, it's like Washington could never really have taken over. He could never really have been king. Oh, yes, he could. Oh, yes, he could. I mean, you talk about how Caesar was in that same position, right? And was able to roll in, right? And off his enemies and take control, right? And essentially put the nail in the coffin of the Republic, and so the idea that Washington could not have done the same, I think, is a little naive. I think it's naive to say that he couldn't have just marshaled his forces, agitated rather than quelling the resentment against the Continental Congress, against the Articles of Confederation and the dysfunctions of the early system. It's naive to say that if he had done that, he wouldn't have stood a real shot at installing himself as absolute ruler, and the virtue that it required to not only not to do that, but several times to insist that that was the wrong course for the country, cannot be overstated. It's an astonishing act of virtue, repeated act, lifetime really of virtue. And so I'd like to make that case with a few instances from history. So my mother, the saint, was in town the other day in Nashville, and she visited my house, and she was like, I have to see if there's actually public good stuff all over your house, because she listens to the podcast and she hears me talk about it. And lo and behold, it is true. I actually love public good stuff so much that I have decorated basically my entire kitchen with their basics. They look great, like on display, sort of on the counter in the sink. They make soaps that are really great, and soaps can be kind of gross and weird. You can get chemicals that aren't good for your skin. You can get stuff slipped in there that because the company thinks they're cheap or whatever. And what I love about public goods is you just know that not only is the packaging going to look great in your home, they're also going to be reliable in terms of what they put into their stuff. And so their food is really good. They have a lot of excellent healthy snacks, those chocolate covered almonds. I can't get enough of them. And just basics too, anything that you can imagine, right? Toilet paper, shampoo, pet food. Chad Cat loves their freeze dried duck nibs, as I always say. And the great thing is that you can get $15 off your first public goods order if you are a Young Heretics listener with no minimum purchase. So you go to publicgoods.com/heretics, PUBLICGOODS.com/heretics. You get $15 of free stuff with no minimum purchase. There are a few moments to talk about here. Many of them centering around this place, Newburgh, which is a place in New York. And this is really near the end, by the end of the Revolutionary War, and it's effectively all over. But the British forces are still there, and so it's not clear yet that they're out of the woods. And this is a particularly fragile moment for a number of reasons. One of which has to do with the fact that there is no money. Right? They've just fought this big war, basically on a shoestring budget. The soldiers have gone through absolute hell. I mean, you talk about some of the stuff they did up in Canada. You talk about the Delaware crossing and the cold, the difficulties they've endured, the blood that they've spilled. They have bled and died and fought for their country. And it's not over. They can't just come back and be hailed as heroes. In fact, there's no money. There's no money to pay them. And this is a serious crisis, an inflation crisis, really, among other things. I mean, inflation even worse than we're currently facing. We think we know about inflation, but it can get real bad. In 1777, $1.25 in continental currency was $1 in specie. That's hard currency. This is the relation of the what is at this point the state currency, right, to hard currency, to gold. By April 1781. $167.50 in continental currency was required to purchase $1 in specie. And so this was, this was a main reason why eventually the Articles of Confederation got scrapped and a new constitution, our constitution, was put in place in 1789, is because, one of the things Congress couldn't do was levy taxes. And so making the federal government stronger was something that everybody knew needed to happen, or was starting to realize needed to happen. There were politicians agitating for it at the time. They were called the Nationalists. Eventually, this would become the sort of case for the capital C Constitution, or part of the case for it. But one of the arguments that would be raised at that point was, look how close we came to outright anarchy and disaster from people who were so dissatisfied with the situation, the money situation, and with not receiving soldiers' wages, that they were ready simply to mutiny, right, before any of this had even been decided in a political way, that is through debate and vote and argumentation. And so Washington was at the heart of these discussions at the time, because people were starting to suggest that the military should make its power felt. And it didn't necessarily, not all the proposals necessarily amounted to, a full-on hostile takeover, but they certainly amounted to threats of force in order to compel the government to comply, either to restructure itself or simply to cough up the money somehow. I mean, some of these plans were not very well formulated. But I want to read to you, first of all, a letter from Colonel Louis Nicola. And he was an officer in the army, and he was seriously, obviously, I mean, everybody was upset by what was going on. This was not like something easy. There's nobody, the point is here is not like, oh, these bad mutineers, really. You can understand why this unrest would have been circulating. But Nicola wrote to Washington while he was stationed at Newburgh. And like I said, this all takes place in Newburgh, because that's sort of where the army had ended up near the end of this conflict. And he wrote to Washington, and he said, "Some people have so connected the ideas of tyranny and monarchy as to find it very difficult to separate them. It may therefore be requisite to give the head of such a constitution as I propose some title apparently more moderate. But if all other things were once adjusted, I believe strong arguments might be produced for admitting the title of king, which I conceive would be attended with some material advantages." So here's a little, first taste. It's not quite as intense as where we're going to go, but this is a taste, and it's a serious taste of, well, we had a bad experience with a bad king. That nasty King George III. But, shouldn't we strengthen the government so that they can at least pay their soldiers, And of course, that's true. You should strengthen the government so they can pay their soldiers. That's what we ended up doing. But Washington, of course, was horrified by the proposition that in order to resolve this, they needed the suggestion, even the merest hint of the possibility, that in order to resolve this, they needed to install a monarch, somebody that could wield executive power. And on the same day, he wrote back, "With a mixture of great surprise and astonishment, I have read with attention the sentiments you have submitted to my perusal. Be assured, sir, no occurrence in the course of the war has given me more painful sensations than your information of there being such ideas existing in the army as you have expressed, and I must view them with abhorrence and reprehend with severity. For the present, the communication of them will rest in my own bosom, unless some further agitation of the matter shall make a disclosure necessary." Whew! That is strong stuff. I mean, that'll stiffen your spine. And you notice how Washington reacts to even the merest, most distant suggestion that he might become king, right? The merest idea that because this government is taking some time to get off the ground, that means what he needs to do is sort of step in and take a strong, forceful hand, and the government should have a king. And Washington, as we'll see in a bit, basically had the exact opposite read on the situation, precisely because we're in a fragile situation, precisely because we've done a revolution, which always has the danger of admitting the principle of revolution, right? That this is simply how we get things done. They were urgently keen. He was urgently keen to show that it did not mean, just because they had thrown off an unjust king, did not mean that they believed simply in politics by perpetual revolution. And this is what sets the American Revolution apart from the French Revolution, right? We talked about this a little bit when I was talking about, Aristotle's idea about changing the laws, and we were talking about Brutus's speech in Julius Caesar over, should we kill Antony too? And Washington is saying, if we're going to do this at all, then we cannot take advantage of the instability which we have in part created. Right, we helped to create this instability by staging a revolution. And if we're going to do that, then it's our responsibility to absolutely shut down any kind of perpetual war that we might enter into, rule by force. And taking control in this way is only going to undermine this fragile project that we have. Very, very delicate business. I mean, this is why I say that it's foolish and naive to suggest that Washington couldn't have done otherwise, just as it's untrue to suggest that Caesar couldn't have done otherwise. For the same reason, which is that they have a kind of power that few people ever have potentially wielded in a moment that rarely comes, when the state is sort of up for grabs. We don't admit this because we think of our country as having dropped from the sky, but no. I mean, there was really a possibility of serious agitation here. And I want just to compare Washington's letter, I want to compare Washington's letter to Caesar's speech, which we read that he reported to the troops, because remember that he too had this, army, and he was sort of marshaling against Pompey. And he reminded them, this is in his own words, right? So it's not like I'm imputing this to Caesar. This is his text from his account of the Civil War. He reminded them of the wrongs done to him at all times by his enemies, and complained that Pompey had been alienated from him and led astray by them through envy and a malicious opposition to his glory. though he had always favored and protected Pompey's honor and dignity. He complained that an innovation had been introduced into the Republic, and that the intercession of the tribunes, which had been restored a few years before by Sylla, was branded as a crime and suppressed by force of arms, that Sylla, who had stripped the tribunes of every other power, had nevertheless left the privilege of intercession unrestrained, that Pompey, who pretended to restore what they had lost, had taken away the privileges which they formerly had, that whenever the Senate decreed that the magistrates should take care that the Republic sustain no injury, by which words and decree the Roman people were obliged to repair to arms, it was only when pernicious laws were proposed, when the tribunes attempted violent measures, when the people seceded and possessed themselves of the temples and eminences of the city. And these instances of former times, he showed them, were expiated by the fate of Saturninus and the Gracchi. That nothing of this kind was attempted now, nor even thought of. That no law was promulgated, no intrigue with the people going forward, no secession made. He exhorted them to defend from the malice of his enemies the reputation and honor of that general under whose command they had for 9 years almost successfully supported the state, fought many successful battles, and subdued all Gaul and Germany. The soldiers of the 13th Legion, which was present, all cry out that they are ready to defend their general, and the tribunes of the commons from all injury. So look, this is why I call Washington the inverse Caesar, right? And the end of the Revolutionary War is the inverse Rubicon moment. It's because listen to how Caesar talks to his army, right? Things that the bad that has been done to me, right? Minimizing the nature of what he's going to do. Well, is really just no major changes are being proposed here, right? There's no need for the kinds of things that were undertaken against the Gracchi, right? There's this and trying to cover over, right, the gravity of what he's doing in hopes of getting the army on his side rather than the side of order, right? That they would do it's not that he necessarily wants them always to do only bad things. It's that it's bad for them to want to do what he wants, to be his. And he contrasts that with Washington's absolute rigor, refusal to countenance even the merest possibility that the army would be at the back of a monarch, would conquer, right, and put an end to this fledgling experiment in republicanism and in throwing off the monarchy. And so this is where we come now to the Newburgh conspiracy. So remember, back in Newburgh now, the year after the letter from Nicola in 1783. There is a suggestion going around. The problems, same problems, right? Problems still of payment and money, and the government is too weak. And so 1783, there begins to circulate a suggestion that the army should mutiny, that there should be an actual attempt to make the force of the army known. And again, if you think that this is if this is sort of idle talk, or that this is, this couldn't have done some real damage had Washington been at the head of it, none other than Hamilton, right? Alexander Hamilton sort of flirts with this idea. There were powerful people in positions to suggest that Washington should potentially go along with this. And here's what Hamilton wrote to Washington. He says, "The claims of the army, urged with moderation but with firmness, may operate on those weak minds which are influenced by their apprehensions more than their judgments, so as to produce a concurrence in the measures which the exigencies of affairs demand. They may add weight to the applications of Congress to the several states, but the difficulty will be to keep a complaining and suffering army within the bounds of moderation. This your excellency's influence must effect. In order to do it, it will be advisable not to discountenance their endeavors to procure redress, but rather by the intervention of confidential and prudential persons to take the direction of them." That is you could skip over it if, sort of gracefully expressed and decorously expressed. So you could skip over it, but to take the direction of the army's plea, clamor, assault for redress. That's suggesting a certain kind of coup, right? Your Excellency should preserve the confidence of the army without losing that of the people. This will enable you, in case of extremity, to guide the torrent and bring order, perhaps even good, out of confusion. Order, right? Taking direction. These are the classic arguments for monarchy. These are the age-old assertions that if you have a disordered situation, if you have a situation of decay and decline, really the best way to resolve it is for one man to step in and rule. And there are arguments of sort of inevitabilism associated with this, which is basically what I'm arguing against. I'm saying that the cycle of regimes is not a death sentence. I'm saying that it's not a prescription. It's the way things tend to go, but that individuals can, in fact, make other choices, and that is what Washington did. He replies to Hamilton. He says, "The army is a dangerous instrument to play with," underscoring the point that I have been making, right? Which is that this is not a joke. It's not a game. This is stuff that you actually can do real damage with if you are in Washington's position. And so Washington, in a kind of characteristic move, he was known for his self-control and reserve, among other things. And though he had a hot temper, we're going to get into this, though he had a hot temper, he often took great measures to restrain himself. So one thing he did is he took some time to think about how he was going to deal with this. And he waited until March 15th, to address the army. And this is the famous Newburgh Address. I've read to you some portions of this before, but I'd like to read again from one of the other portions that we didn't read last time, so that you can sort of hear Washington's greatness. This isn't even the only example that I have to give you, but of Washington, the inverse Caesar. But I did want to revisit the Newburgh Address. Let's do it. I got to tell you, human resources is like an entire little government unto itself. And you need good people to deal with it, which is why Bambi is such a lifesaver for small businesses, especially. If you have ever had an employee altercation in the workplace, performance issues, complaints, any of that stuff, you know how incredibly hair-raisingly difficult it can be to navigate the minefield of regulations and compliance. It can cost up to $80,000 a year to hire an in-house manager for that stuff. And that would take care of it, but then it would just, you'd be spending all this money on it. With Bambi, your dedicated HR manager starts at just $99 a month. This is the company that helps you get compliant with HR. It's a platform built for businesses just like yours, small businesses that need to automate the most important HR practices and get your own dedicated HR manager. When you go to Bambee.com/heretics, you can get a free HR audit just for Young Heretics listeners. That's BAMBEE.com/heretics, HERETICS, Bambee.com/heretics for a free HR audit. Don't get caught up and tangled up in all sorts of HR situations. You want to be running your business. You don't want to have to think about this stuff. Bambi can help. BAMBEE.com/heretics. So here's what Washington says to the army in the Newburgh Address. It's March 15th, 1783. He says, "If my conduct heretofore has not evinced to you that I have been a faithful friend to the army, my declaration of it at this time would be equally unavailing and improper. But as I was among the first who embarked in the cause of our common country, as I have never left your side one moment, but when called from you on public duty, as I have been the constant companion and witness of your distresses, and not among the last to feel and acknowledge your merits, as I have ever considered my own military reputation as inseparably connected with that of the army, as my heart has ever expanded with joy when I have heard its praises, and my indignation has arisen when the mouth of detraction has been opened against it, it can scarcely be supposed at this late stage of the war that I am indifferent to its interests." He's saying, I'm your friend, right? I have always fought for you. I've always spoken up for your interests. I'm not insensitive to the wrongs that have been done to you. "While I give you these assurances," he goes on, "and pledge myself in the most unequivocal manner to exert whatever ability I am possessed of in your favor, let me entreat you, gentlemen, on your part, not to take any measures which, viewed in the calm light of reason, will lessen the dignity and sully the glory you have hitherto maintained. Let me request you to rely on the plighted faith of your country and place a full confidence in the purity of the intentions of Congress, that previous to your dissolution as an army, they will cause all your acts to be fairly liquidated as directed in their resolutions, which were published to you 2 days ago, and that they will adopt the most effectual measures in their power to render ample justice to you for your faithful and meritorious services. And let me conjure you, in the name of our common country, as you value your own sacred honor, as you respect the rights of humanity, and as you regard the military and national character of America, to express your utmost horror and detestation of the man who wishes, under any specious pretenses, to overturn the liberties of our country, and who wickedly attempts to open the floodgates of civil discord and deluge our rising empire in blood." People have sometimes said that Washington was not the greatest literary figure of the of the framers, and of course, Jefferson probably wins the title of the best pen among them, having penned indeed the Declaration, right, which we celebrate on July 4th and every day, of course. But this is a manly and noble speech, I must say, and well composed. And it's just, you have to imagine him in that room, right, with armed men clamoring whether he went with them or not. Right, some of them saying that they would go, right, and try to make Congress give them some redress, and Washington, in the most measured possible terms, is telling them the opposite of Caesar. He's saying, don't be faithful to Caesar. Don't put your faith in princes. Don't put your allegiances on any one man, me or anybody else, who tries to lead you into deluging our rising empire in blood, but instead trust in Congress, right? Put your faith in the law. Let the law be the one that makes these decisions, and let the army be at the mercy of the law. Because they, if you trust them, they will remunerate you, and then we will have a system, a rule of law, right? It's an amazing, it takes unbelievable restraint, especially in the heat of mob conspiracy. It takes unbelievable restraint for a man to stand up and say that. And then, of course, famously, it's said that he pulled a letter from his pocket that had Congress's intentions to redress the army, right? And he said, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." You can imagine that what the mood of the army was in that situation. I mean, they hung on his every word. They knew him for who he was. They knew that he was a man of virtue and principle. When he reminds them there of his bona fides, right, of having stood by them at all times, you really get a sense that, of course, this is somebody who has the best interest not only of his army but of his nation at heart. And again, we can take this for granted, but this could have gone very differently with anybody else in charge, And so the last thing that I want to meditate upon before I start reflecting on the nature of this choice that Washington makes again and again, right, not to become king, not to seek total control, and instead to reinforce, right, belief in the system, belief in the rule of law, belief in the Constitution when it eventually comes into being, right? I want to talk about this, the implications of it for today and for some of what's going on all around us. But first, I want to say a few more things about Washington, including to note, right, that he was unanimously elected, right? So again, if you doubt what I'm telling you about the support he enjoyed among the people in the army, he could have led them anywhere. And if you don't think so, then I just don't think that you've really reckoned with the things that can actually happen in real life. We have a country that has been so stable for so long. We don't really think that these sorts of things actually happen. But Caesar shows that they do, right? Men of ambition really do seize control of armies, right, and overthrow regimes. That's a thing that exists. And to say that Washington couldn't have done that at any point, really, that he had that he really put his mind to it, if he had ever been swayed by these invitations, is I think to deny the existence of real disaster and real political disaster in this world. And this world history is almost a succession of political disasters. So again, unanimous election 2 times, never been repeated, right? The only time he was unanimously elected in 1789, right? And the only time that's ever happened again in our country's history was 1792 when he was reelected. And this is just an amazing display, right, of who he was, that to his people, that they loved him so, and then, right, he did the most unimaginable thing, the thing that you could, even having defended the Constitution, even having won a unanimous election within a legitimate system, and having at his disposal basically lifelong presidency. There were no term limits at the time. And indeed, Washington is effectively inventing term limits in this moment by stepping down, right? This is the thing. After having won 2 unanimous elections, he chooses to give up the presidency and to go home. And this is an amazing feat. Again, even perhaps in some ways more amazing than the Newburgh moment, because now he actually has a nation, right, that is, lives by a certain constitution, lives by the rule of law, and still he won't take total control of it. And so I wanted to read to you now from his farewell address a little bit. When he stepped down, he wrote this speech, which was given to Congress, never delivered in vocally, but it's preserved as a written document. And it begins by he's explaining why he would step down, because again, right, like Washington invented term limits, and it wasn't until much later, after FDR, that they were actually made legal, right? That the term limits were a matter of law. But nobody ever again would hold more than 2 terms in office until FDR, because of this incredible act that he did. But at the time, it was assumed, of course, that if you could have this kind of power, why wouldn't you, right? So here's what he says to explain himself. He says, "Friends and fellow citizens, the period for a new election of a citizen to administer the executive government of the United States being not far distant, and the time actually arrived when your thoughts must be employed in designating the person who is to be clothed with that important trust, it appears to me proper, especially as it may conduce to a more distinct expression of the public voice, that I should now apprise you of the resolution I have formed to decline being considered among the number of those out of whom a choice is to be made. I beg you at the same time to do me the justice to be assured that this resolution has not been taken without a strict regard to all the considerations appertaining to the relation which binds a dutiful citizen to his country, and that, in withdrawing the tender of service, which silence in my situation might imply, I am influenced by no diminution of zeal for your future interest, no deficiency of grateful respect for your past kindness, but am supported by a full conviction that the step is compatible with both the acceptance of and continuance hitherto in the office to which your suffrages have twice called me have been a uniform sacrifice of inclination to the opinion of duty and to a deference for what appeared to be your desire. I constantly hoped that it would have been much earlier in my power, consistently with motives which I was not at liberty to disregard, to return to that retirement from which I had been reluctantly drawn. The strength of my inclination to do this, previous to the last election, had even led to the preparation of an address to declare it to you. But mature reflection on the then perplexed and critical posture of our affairs with foreign nations and the unanimous advice of persons entitled to my confidence impelled me to abandon the idea. I rejoice that the state of your concerns, external as well as internal, no longer renders the pursuit of inclination incompatible with the sentiment of duty or propriety, and am persuaded, whatever partiality may be retained for my services, that in the present circumstances of our country, you will not disapprove my determination to retire." What an amazing document. Again, easy to overlook because we take it for granted. But what he is saying is that what determines my assumption of power is not whether I can get it, not whether you will give it to me, but whether you have need of my exercise of it. That's the principle, the actual good of the actual people being ruled. Like, imagine that should be what guides a man in taking up and putting down power. He's saying, I wanted to put it down earlier, but I think you needed me, and now you no longer need me, and so I'm stepping down. This is why we portray the man as Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus, the famous sort of semi-legendary Roman hero who was made dictator as part, never mind dictator for life. There was a dictatorship in the Roman constitution for times of emergency and war, and Cincinnatus was appointed dictator, but he was dragged away from his farm. And the idea there is that, the man who's fit to rule is the man who doesn't want to rule. And similar to Plato's cave, right? You have to pull a man back down out of the light and into the cave again, force them to rule now that they've been enlightened. And Cincinnatus gave up the power as soon as he possibly could and went back to his farm. This is, Washington has famously in statues been portrayed as Cincinnatus for this reason, that he would say, I'm putting down this power because you don't need me anymore, not because I don't want it. I didn't want it in the first place, but I'm putting it down. This was really, I think, the moment when our republic was a republic. I mean, there were many things, of course, that were hugely, crucially important. There was the Revolutionary War, there was the Declaration, there was the Constitution itself, right, and the creation of this regime that we now live in. But this was the capstone that realized the vision, that made it real, was when you had a man in office who set the example of setting power aside voluntarily. And he had done it all over throughout his life, and it was a fitting pinnacle of his career to do it with the presidency, having attained legitimate power and having the option really of persisting in it with no foreseeable end to put it down. This news of this sort of series of actions on Washington's part earned the following assessment from George III, who, remember, they had cast George III off. And he told the painter, Benjamin West, that this act placed him in a light made him the most distinguished of any man living and the greatest character of the age. So if you want to say like this was not that big a deal, that Washington could never really have been king, like there was a real honest to gosh, flesh and blood, real life king who said himself, this is the most amazing thing I've ever seen, right? This is the most distinguished of any man living and the greatest character of his age. To earn that tribute from a monarch, right? From somebody who has the power that Washington has given up is really astonishing and tells you that the Caesar route is not the only route, right? It doesn't mean, look, last time that we sort of talked about Plato, I got into talking about this distinction between the world's logic, which is the logic of violence and power, and divine logic, which is the logic of reason and peace, right? And we live in the world, which is fallen, which tends all things toward death, and which is basically a veil of sin. There's lots of bad stuff that happens, and the world's logic, which is the logic of power, the animalistic logic of getting what you can, taking what you get. That logic tends toward one direction, right? And that is the concentration of power in those who can get it. The strong do what they can, while the weak suffer what they must. And so Caesar is unremarkable in that way. He's a remarkable man in many other ways, but in that way, to be a man at the head of an army, to have vanquished Pompey, to have vanquished his opponent, and then to take total control of the state, essentially. That man is unremarkable in that way. That's what you would expect from the world. But the divine act, right? The act of a godly man who is inspired by the intervention, right, of divine reason into the mechanistic logic of the world. The act of that man is to turn the clock back, right? To turn the world back against itself and undo the hardening of power, to give power over where it has accrued. And of course, our whole founding was about that. But Washington's life was about that. Washington embodied it. That's why he's a great man. That's why he's the most distinguished of any man living and the greatest character of the age. King George is right about that. And this is, something that is just impossible for us to fathom because it doesn't fit with the logic of the world, which tells you, right, that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. That's just where things go. The cycle of regimes rolls on, and all those things may be perfectly true, right? All those things may be true according to the logic of the world, and yet does not mean we have no choice. There is such a thing as the intervention of the divine, right? The divine, which is able to make rational choices, right? And to push back against the flesh and against the desire for power. And to see a man actually do that in these monumental ways again and again, it's inspiring, right? We have to return to these examples because we need to be inspired by them in our day, which I'm going to get to in just a moment. But let me read to you actually this letter from Thomas Jefferson to Jones. In 1814, he writes to Walter Jones, and he's assessing Washington's character, right, after Washington's death, and just, sort of considering him in the clearest and most honest light he can. Jefferson had criticisms of Washington. They were not, the fastest of allies. And yet, here's what Jefferson writes. He says, his mind was great and powerful, without being of the very first order. His penetration strong, though not so acute as that of a Newton, Bacon, or Locke, and as far as he saw, no judgment was ever sounder. Maybe let's just pause there, actually, because this is something that's often said, as I mentioned, this is something that's often said about Washington. He was not the smartest of the founders. He was just the best, right? The morally best. And my feeling is like, yeah, Newton, Bacon, and Locke, all, great thinkers, but great thinkers of a certain sort, right? And to be able to make moral judgments and execute on them is also a form of strength of mind, right? So as far as he saw, no judgment was ever sounder. We shouldn't dismiss that. The legacy of a Washington is, in many ways, I think, superior to the legacy of a Newton, Bacon, or a Locke, all of which have relatively mixed legacies, I would say, in the subsequent history. Washington's legacy, as far as I'm concerned, is unalloyed good. It was slow in operation, being little aided by invention or imagination. This is Washington's mind, but sure in conclusion. Hence the common remark of his officers, of the advantage he derived from councils of war, where hearing all suggestions, he selected whatever was best, and certainly no general ever planned his battles more judiciously. But if deranged during the course of the action, if any member of his plan was dislocated by sudden circumstances, he was slow in readjustment. The consequence was that he often failed in the field and rarely against an enemy in station, as at Boston and York. He was incapable of fear, meeting personal dangers with the calmest unconcern. Perhaps the strongest feature in his character was prudence, never acting until every circumstance, every consideration was maturely weighed, refraining if he saw a doubt, but when once decided, going through with his purpose, whatever obstacles opposed. His integrity was most pure, his justice the most inflexible I have ever known, no motives of interest or consanguinity, of friendship or hatred being able to bias his decision. He was indeed, in every sense of the words, a wise, a good, and a great man. And amen to that. I mean, there was a captain, Samuel Shaw, who said about the Newburgh conspiracy, on other occasions he had been supported by the exertions of the army, the countenance of his friends, but in this he stood single and alone. This is what makes him a giant among men, that he was able to do that he had that courage of his convictions and the rightness of his judgment, right? That no mind saw clearer. In what he saw, no mind saw clearer. And it tells you, again, that Caesar's way is not the only way. It is the way of the world, right? It's the way that things go if you just, don't push back against them, if you never exert any other opposing force. But it is not the only way, because we are endowed by God, right, with reason and with the capacity for virtue and with the ability to choose against the way of the world, right? To fight, to push back against the wheel of history, which only ever trends toward death, right? This is what it means to live in a fallen world. People think, oh, sin, right? That's nasty. That's you being bad. You do bad things, or you have bad thoughts. And of course, you do bad things. You do have bad thoughts, and that's part of sin. That's a consequence of the fall. But it's so much bigger than that, right? It's that you want to talk about systemic, right? The world is set up for human things to die, for the greatest things to pass away, and to return them or to found them, right, takes effort. It takes digging in your heels and insisting that the course of history is not a one-way street, that it's not an absolute, that we're just going to go this way. This is why I'm so keen about this whole despair thing. That's why I insist on it again and again, right? That despair is a sin. Why? Because your whole job, your whole existence as a rational animal on this earth is predicated on the idea that ain't so. It ain't so that anything is written in stone. Look, you don't have control over everything, and not everybody will be in the position of a Washington, right? Some men are placed in a particular position to have a very consequential effect on history. And some things are out of your control, but you are not locked into a script that history dictates. And only in retrospect will you know kind of what the grand narrative was. You have a job, and that job is to listen to the voice of reason and to seek virtue, to pursue the good wherever you find yourself, whether your influence is over a single life or a household or a school or a baseball team, whatever, right? Whatever your area of sway is, you have the same calling as George Washington, and he can lead you, right? He is a perfect example for every man because, right, on this vast stage, he does what we're all supposed to do, and that is shoulder against the world, right? Dig in our heels and say that it's not fated, that everything will always fall apart, because God does love us. He is among us, and he does give us the power to choose the good, even when ambition and power are very, very strong. We do still have the power to choose to live free. So let's talk about the present, because this is where we go next, right? We have to think about whether this spirit is still possible in the modern age. And that's what I'd like to spend a little time on now. If you are an athlete or just a human with a body, which I suspect if you're listening to me, then you are, you need a Theragun. These things are magic. You don't know how much tension you're holding. This is really true until you try something like this out. It's a handheld percussive therapy device that releases your deepest muscle tension with a scientifically calibrated combo of depth, speed, and power. It feels great, but the most important thing is this is releasing all sorts of tension that you, again, probably don't realize you're carrying around. Maybe you sit at a desk all day, maybe you work out a lot, maybe you haven't been able to work out recently, so you've been immobile. Whatever you're doing, you're bound to just carry the stress of it with you throughout the day. And Theragun Gen 4 is a fantastic tool for dealing with that. It's quiet, it's sleek, and you can try it for 30 days starting at only $199 when you go to therabody.com/heretics. That's therabody.com/heretics, just like in the title, HERETICS. And it's a special deal just for my listeners. You can start for 30 days at $199. This stuff really does add up. You sort of go through every day. It gets just a little bit worse. You never really notice. And then before you know it, you've got like an injury. So avoid that. Just go to therabody.com/heretics to try it for 30 days, starting at only $199. I hope that I've addressed some of the kind of potential naysayers to this suggestion that I'm making, that you don't have to do the Caesar thing, right? That Caesar, a man with an army at his back, is not necessarily best destined by fate to become a despot, right? He might be in a position in history where he needs to exert extraordinary control, right? And even Washington, of course, exerted extraordinary power, wielded extraordinary power, but he wielded it in the name of the good of the people, right? And this is, and my point is only that it is possible to do that. It is possible to choose the common good over your own ambition. It's possible to give power back to those who are rightly granted it by God. It's possible to invest sovereignty in the people, in your legal system, even when you have power to take it from them. All of these things can be done. Washington shows us that they can be done. And so I will not hear the people that say either that Washington couldn't have taken control. He could have. Caesar shows us that. But I also won't hear anyone say that Caesar shows us that these things are inevitable. He doesn't. There's some inevitability that surrounds us, but within that context, we have choices. And somebody like a Washington has big choices. I might have small choices, you might have small choices, but the size of it really doesn't actually matter. The virtue of it matters, and the fact that you have the choice matters. And so the last kind of naysayer that I can hear in my ear, the person that I can hear kind of shrugging all of this off is, yeah, well, this is all very naive at our late stage, right? Our advanced stage of decay, because Washington's at the beginning of a new endeavor. Which, is sort of true. Although, as I said, he's also at the end of a different endeavor. He's at the end of a war, which is a very vulnerable time. A lot of wars have ended with people, monarchs taking control, despots taking control. But okay, fair enough. Granted, let's say he's at the beginning of endeavor, and Caesar is at the end of something. Caesar's in a republic whose health is really failing. And I think, we are in a republic which, again, nothing's written in the stars, but we're in a republic also which is really suffering from the kinds of decay and decline that can be terminal. This oligarchic seizure of control that Machiavelli talks about, this sort of replacement of or use of the constitutional system as a sort of pretext for class warfare, for class prejudice and interests. All of these things are very much on the table. And so you might say, well, we're really so far gone. Our Rubicon moment was way back in the distance. I mean, maybe it was the New Deal, maybe it was the 60s, maybe it was, and conservatives love, this is a conservative's favorite question. It's like, when was our Rubicon moment? When did we decide? When did everything fall apart for us that it became inevitable? And what I've sort of been suggesting to you here is like, that's a fool's game, really. That's like a game that you can only play in retrospect. And even in retrospect, it's like, what good does it really do you to be like, yes, well, we're doomed. And, it's very interesting and important to look back at all the ways that, how we got here. But I'm interested in knowing, like, are we doomed? And is it true that all this talk is sort of pleasant nothings because, in fact, like, it's not possible. It's too late for anybody to exert power. To reestablish, to refound the true American regime, the Republic. And I would like to suggest, actually, that our Supreme Court decisions recently suggests that it's not too late, and at least that the possibility still remains. It's not like there's not, a million obstacles still in front of us. There always are going to be. But a lot of these decisions that have come down from the Supreme Court lately have been an instance of people. Look, nobody is Washington. Washington stands alone. But the Washingtonian spirit, that spirit of believing that you can choose virtue over your own power and ambition, which is the fundamentally American spirit. It goes back to Jocasta, right? Would you rather save your country or rule it? And you have to be more willing to save your country than to rule it. That's what Washington is effectively saying in his farewell address. And in these decisions that we've gotten, there have been a lot of indications that this court genuinely believes in stripping itself of power. Most notably, of course, in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health, right? This is the decision that overturned Roe and Casey. And I've talked a lot about abortion, what an atrocity I think it is. And I don't need to go again with you into my beliefs on the right to life and the beginning of life at conception. And I've talked about this at really kind of no end of length. But there is a constitutional dimension to Dobbs, which is as important. I mean, nothing can quite come close to abortion morally as a moral issue, but as a constitutional issue, in that sphere, it's equally important to remember that Roe was a total assault on the nature of our system. It wrote into legislation a whole system of adjudicating abortion that was very obviously still under debate within the American system. Now, I'm not saying that it's not possible that eventually we might not get to, like, say, a constitutional amendment to resolve this issue of personhood. I think we probably can. But in order to do that, right, you have to go through the hard, long work of persuading your fellow citizens so that you can elect legislators who can then together form like a super majority, right, who can then, pursue. This is why the Constitution is hard to amend, is that in order to change the law of the land, you have to, doing that means locking things in, right? And in order to lock something in, you have to really persuade people. And Roe took that power away from both the pro-life and the pro-abortion side, right? Like those two sides have not had to argue, not been able to argue their case. And that's had, incredibly ugly effects on the pro-abortion side, which has really sort of shown its true colors because it never has to argue anymore. They just shout their abortion, and it has had also really painful effects for the pro-life side, which has been beating at the gates. Right, please just let us back into the democratic process. For almost 50 years, and to have it's a monumental thing to have a court that took a look at that and said, you know what, we're going to give this power back. We didn't take it rightly, and we're giving it back. This court did not take that power rightly. And there have been a few others too, New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin, which reaffirmed the Second Amendment, the right to have guns to defend yourself, right? Carson v. Macon, Kennedy v. Bremerton, these religious liberty decisions, all of them, I think, really involve, people talk about turning back the time, right? But the decisions that insofar as they overturned decisions, they overturned decisions that gave more power to judges. And so you're looking at the Washingtonian spirit at work, at least in the courts, right? And that suggests to me that it's not impossible for leaders, even still, to have enough virtue to choose the good over their own power, right? And it suggests that we too can choose that and can elect leaders who will choose that. We have a long way to go. We had another decision, West Virginia v. EPA, which sort of tentatively said Congress is the one that makes laws. I mean, we need to be much more forceful about that because Congress is the one that's accountable. But it's not impossible for that Washingtonian spirit to turn back the tide of decay. Decline is reversible. It just takes a lot of effort and it takes civic virtue. And I think that is, what our project has to be. And I don't think it's helpful to say, well, the ship has sailed, right? What does that do for our virtue or for our determination, right? Because these things, the door is open a crack. The door is cracked open, and we can push it further open. We can actually revitalize our Republican system. The Caesar of it all is not inevitable. It's part of the world. It's part of the way of all things. But that doesn't mean that we today have to roll over and take it. I know a lot of people are putting this argument out there that really monarchy is the only inevitable consequence of our current decline and decay. And the point of the last 3 episodes has basically been to say, like hell, we're not done yet. There have been comparisons where obviously when you talk about coups, you're talking about, you have to mention the January 6th hearings, the show trial that's going on right now as I record this. And it's like, I'm not sure what much to say about it. I think, if Trump is anyone in this whole, comparison with the decline of the Roman Empire, and he's kind of the Gracchi, it's like he gave voice to popular resentment, which was justified resentment about dispossession and economic, economic closure of the middle classes out of the market. He gave voice to that. He was an imperfect vessel. He did some incredibly irresponsible things, and eventually he was both implicated in and defeated by politics by riot, both the riot of January 6th, in which he was implicated, and the riots of summer 2020, which severely weakened all of the things that he had done for good. He's not out of it yet, thank God. He wasn't assassinated, but they're trying to paint him as this Caesar figure. He's really not. He's a Gracchus figure. He's an indicator that we have entered into an incredibly turbulent period in our republic, and he's basically a sign of those times. But all this stuff, you probably don't need me to say this, but like Cassidy Hutchinson coming forward and saying, well, he wanted the metal detectors to be taken away so that weapons could be brought onto the ellipse. It's obvious that he was. Look, I'm no fan of his behavior on January 6th. Don't get me wrong. I'm no fan of how Trump behaved in that time frame. But to suggest that he was trying to arm a mob and lead an army, like that's just not what he was saying. He said something like, "They're not here to hurt me," meaning like you don't have to weapons test them because they're not here to kill me while I give my speech, But anyway, I digress a little bit only to say that like the idea that Trump is our Caesar when we're already, we had an insurrection, right? That's a kind of a smokescreen. Where we really are is in our pre-Caesar moment. And we have a lot of people who say that means Caesar is inevitable. And I have been suggesting to you that not only is that an unhelpful attitude, it's also fundamentally wrong because it is possible for individuals and whole nations, whole societies to choose the good, to choose freedom, right? And to choose freedom even if it needs to be reinstated, right? After a period of decline. All of these things are possible. Our Supreme Court is showing some daylight, some interest, right, in making that possible. We need to insist upon it from our legislators, which is sort of the next step. But the way is open, man. We're not done yet. It's not the end. And you better hope it's not the end because this nation is the greatest that has ever been. And we can still protect it. Happy America Month. Let's keep fighting. And let's take a mailbag question. You probably don't even know the ways that Truebill can help you until you try them out. We all, and I very much include myself in this, fall for subscription scams where we get offered some great deal or some like, $1 for the New York Times. And like, I have to confess to you that I actually did once fall for this at the Los Angeles Times. So I subscribed to Los Angeles Times, a paper I abhor, which don't let it happen to you. But the way to fix this is to check out Truebill. They will roll through your subscriptions and just find the ones that, you've used before, but you weren't using them anymore, or you just wanted a free trial. You were only looking for one article or whatever. On average, people save up to $720 a year this way. And it could be much more for you, depending on what you've gotten signed up for over the years, especially the first time you run through it. For Young Heretics listeners only, there is a link, truebill.com/heretics. It's truebill.com/heretics. Could save you thousands a year. Matt B says in a matter of seconds, I saved $660 for the year on my DirecTV bill, $120 for the year on my Sirius XM bill, and $840 a year on my car insurance. That stuff adds up, man, and you do not need it weighing down your wallet. Truebill.com/heretics to start canceling today. Mailbag questions come to me on Locals. Locals is a community online that is free of censorship, created by my buddy Dave Rubin. I was just on his panel for 4th of July, so go check that out if you haven't yet. And if you want to become a VIP, I would really welcome you. I hope that you will join us. It's a great community. We talk about so much important stuff. Really, it's about applying the wisdom of the ancient world to your life, right? And that's part of my book, too. I have this book out, coming out called How to Save the West, which you can pre-order on Amazon or wherever you get your books. But you can also join us on Locals to become a VIP and to sort of ask me directly questions that you have about your life or, how to apply ancient wisdom to modern problems. Today, I thought I would take kind of a more fun question because we've been dealing with some heavy stuff. And I thought we might just adventure into some of my more niche interests, which, by the way, I think after we've done, this is the end of America Month on Young Heretics. And I think that we'll probably move on maybe into some music, possibly even some modern stuff, do some reviews of modern stuff. Always, of course, with an eye to, what the ancient wisdom can tell us about this new stuff. So to transition us into a slightly more modern fare, here's Tyler. If I recall correctly, you got Andrew Klavan no relation to PS5. So on the video game topic, this was aimed both at me and Josh, who got Dad a PS5. So on the video game topic, what are some of your thoughts on video games that you'd like to share? Favorite franchise, soundtrack, characters, storylines, etc. Bonus points for talking about Halo, Elden Ring, or Final Fantasy. Well, we're going to talk more about this on our live stream with the VIPs, but I am going to talk about Final Fantasy here because, so my dad and I grew up playing video games together, or I grew up playing video games with my dad, I should say. My dad has always loved games, just overall. My father, no relation, has been, a big fan of games from the beginning. He loves, word games and puzzles, but he also, when video games came along, Space Invaders, he always tells the story about getting Space Invaders wrist, where you had to punch the button so hard that he just got like, I don't know, I guess it's carpal tunnel or something. And we had Super Nintendo growing up, and he was so patient with me, and I would sort of get frustrated because I was little and I couldn't beat it. And then I got to the point where I could beat him all the time. And I can still beat him all the time at video games. But this is sort of beside the point because, now we have this system, this new system. And it's been really fun to introduce for Josh to introduce me and Dad to some of his favorite games. And Final Fantasy has been a big part of that. I wrote some stuff about Final Fantasy on Law and Liberty because I just think it's so beautiful as a game. And I will say that I had never really experienced the open world stuff before, and I had never experienced the turn-based fighting the RPG stuff. I guess I'm kind of a noob when it comes to RPGs. Let's put it that way. And I got really into the history of RPGs as I was learning about Final Fantasy, because it's so cool to me the way you can watch an artistic medium come into being. And my dad and I have talked about this too. It's like, you start with tabletop, right? You start with Dungeons and Dragons, and then you have these kind of RPGs where your characters basically are, meeples from the tabletop game. And gradually you add in characterization and you add in more customizability, but also sort of freer space to move about in, and, more elaborate stories. And in Japan, of course, particularly, the character development becomes much more important. And so by the time you get to Final Fantasy, you're really witnessing an art form coming into its own. I mean, and so that's very moving to me, actually, in a funny way. And there are characters you really connect to. There are questions about identity that are being worked out. Who am I, right? And how do I know who I am? So I love that game. I didn't really, I guess we have never been able to get my dad to play the original. But we did, I think, get him the Final Fantasy Remake, which I have not played, but Josh has. And this was like, they remastered it and did it with real-time fighting instead of turn-based fighting. And they also kind of expanded out the story in this really fascinating way. So a big fan of that, excited to kind of share that with him. And then this was a great one, a throwback, because my dad and I, particularly when we played together, we would play a lot of the platformers. I love a good platformer, and that's what I'm good at. I'm great at platformers. And so we would crash Bandicoot, which we found one day in like a bargain bin that we had no idea we were getting into, but of course Crash is like incredible. And there was, Jack and Daxter. There was, of course, every possible Mario game, which I now carry on the proud tradition by playing Mario with my nephew. There's just, all these platformers, you name it, Spyro, you name it, I've been into it. And one of them that we loved was Ratchet and Clank. And Ratchet and Clank has now come into this incredible, like Pixar level PlayStation 5 version. And so playing that was awesome and brought back all these incredible memories. You have this nostalgia sort of associated. We're getting really nerdy here, but I think platformers, it's harder in a platformer to really get a great story going. There are obvious notable exceptions: Braid, Mega Man, Inside, right? There are lots of platformers with great stories, Heart of Darkness, but it can be harder because they can be more formulaic to get something really good and interesting going on. But the graphics alone on Ratchet and Clank are unbelievable. All right, that'll hopefully give you some fodder, and let me know on Locals what you've been playing. I'm excited to talk more about it on the live stream. All right, folks. That is it for America Month. I think we probably, by the time you hear this, will be out of the month of July, but it doesn't matter because, we ought to always celebrate America as far as I'm concerned. Certainly, if we're celebrating Pride for a month, we ought to be celebrating America for at least 2 months. Thanks for going with me on this journey, as always. If you like this stuff, and if you like talking about America especially, you should definitely check out the Claremont Institute, where I work. It's ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com, AmericanMind.org, both stellar websites, one a physical publication also that you can hold in your hand. And we write stuff about the American idea, the founding, and the history of the country. We review books, obviously, CRB. And you can donate to support us at claremont.org/donate. Let them know in the notes that you heard about us through Young Heretics. That gives us special brownie points over here. It gives me special brownie points as, one of the Institute's employees. I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.